afternoon. Welcome to episode 18. You are trapped in history with me, Robbie Malcomson. This podcast is meant to support history teachers, students, as well as anyone who is purely interested in history. Today's episode is going to be the Northern Renaissance and its transformations. I would recommend, if you haven't had a chance to listen to the episode I did yesterday, episode 17 over the Italian Renaissance, then I would recommend to listen to that before this one, just because it will provide you for some much needed contextualization before jumping in to today's topic. But I hope, as yesterday, I hope that this podcast helps the students that are doing Unit 1 in AP Euro. I hope that it helps out teachers that are just starting out to be able to do the class, or just anybody interested in the Renaissance. I hope that it values them. So for background on the topic today, the Northern Renaissance was a period that paralleled the Italian Renaissance, but developed its own distinct characteristics in Northern Europe. While the Italian Renaissance focused on classical revival and human achievement, the Northern Renaissance blended intellectual reform with a focus on realism and religious change. Today we'll dive into these key ideas and figures. Today's episode includes segments on Northern Renaissance art, the printing press's impact, political shifts under new monarchs, and a discussion about the influential thinker Erasmus, who we also mentioned a little yesterday. So if you go back to the last episode, there was a stronger focus on secularism than non-religious ideas. And the way I like to introduce this topic, the last half of the part of the Unit 1 about the Renaissance, is that now imagine taking those ideas from the Italian Renaissance and now blurring them or meshing them with religious ideas and religious reform, and trying to change religion from within, not like splitting it away or dividing it. So it'll be a much different style than what we'll see with Martin Luther and others later on. So the quote of the week will be from, I guess there should be two quotes this week. It's from Erasmus, the Christian humanist of the 16th century. His quote says, "The desire of knowledge, like the thirst of riches, increases ever with the acquisition of it." So implying that the more we learn, the more knowledgeable and enlightened we become, the more that we strive for that, or we desire to gain more of that knowledge. To provide a little more contextualization to Erasmus's quote, this captures the Renaissance spirit of inquiry, that questioning attitude that we talked about in episode 17, particularly in the North, though, where humanism is going to blend with Christian reform. Erasmus believed that knowledge was a pathway to both personal and societal improvement, reflecting Northern Renaissance ideals. And Erasmus's belief in the endless pursuit of knowledge reminds us of the intellectual hunger that defined the Northern Renaissance and led to a critical questioning of traditional authorities. So if you're like me and you do like to have a classroom that is predicated in building your culture to be able to have discussions and debate and being able to deal with conflict meaningfully, I think Erasmus is a great source to be able to use here. And obviously there are other figures too in the Northern Renaissance that push for reform. Erasmus is just that main figure that if I were you, I'd recommend knowing that in case of the AP exam, or just knowing it for the future. So the source or document of the week will be another one of Erasmus's writings. This time it's going to be an excerpt from the Handbook of a Christian Knight, which was published in 1503. Within that source, and you can look up the longer one, I'm just going to grab a line from it to share. He says, "True piety consists in living as Christ would have us live, not in performing outward rituals." And if you look at the date on there, this is coming right before Martin Luther will post his 95 Thesis there in the 15 teens. But you can already tell that there's some unrest within, like beyond the church and within the church a little bit too. Students will probably be unfamiliar with the word piety, and piety meaning like how fervent you are, how committed to religion you are, to your faith that you are. So it's almost like a measuring of that as well. And then your outward rituals, that could be things like sacraments, other activities and whatnot. Now, as we'll find out in Unit 2, you might even want to lump things like indulgences in there and like the unethical sale of those. So it's not about what you're doing with money or certain things like that, but it's more of your own individual relationship with God and with the scripture, which again is very, very unique and different than what we would have seen there before the Renaissance and the Middle Ages. To provide a little bit of an overview for that document, if you're a teacher or student and you want to take a deeper look into it, the text serves for people in Europe at the time as a practical guide for Christians striving to live virtuously in a very corrupt world, blending humanist thought with Christian devotion. It's a prime example of Northern Renaissance humanism. So there's that consistent theme you're going to hear through the episode today, is that you have these classical beliefs again, this individualism, this questioning attitude, but now you're bringing it into Christianity. You're going to bring it in there and try to reform things from within. Especially, this is great because the majority of Europe is very religious and very superstitious and whatnot at the time. So this would have resonated with a pretty wide audience at that time, and the printing press will surely not hurt at spreading those ideas. So the significance of Erasmus's work here is that it's aimed to reconcile religious piety with the intellectual rigor of humanism. The text advocates for a more personal, scripture-focused faith that contrasts with the institutionalized practices of the church. And basically, some of this criticism from within and beyond of the Catholic Church at the time were some of these policies and outward rituals that were added, later on that were not, explicitly in Scripture, and some of these some would argue to be unethical, or at least not a measure of one's true faith towards Christianity. Now, in class, if you're a student or a teacher and you want to use this, we could have a discussion over this and how this source reflects Northern humanism's emphasis on personal spirituality, scriptural study, and moral reform, which were key drivers of the later Reformation, which, as we know, is going to be Unit 2 coming up really soon. Now, some teachers choose to teach Unit 1 and 2 together, or at least sometimes combine the Renaissance and Reformation as one section together. They're both happening around the same time and on top of each other. And then they will do their exploration period after that. And then they may do an exam that combines Unit 1 and 2 together. Now, for the last 5 years, I just kind of stick with the plan that AP does, and I go ahead and teach Renaissance and exploration. But in the future, I may actually entertain that idea. I may try that out. But I do make it very clear that when I go to Unit 2, I show that timeline of more like a wedding cake diagram. I have the students fill out the wedding cake with the ideas at the bottom of the Italian and Northern Renaissance, and then in exploration, and then I move up and I do the Reformation and explain to them that a wedding cake timeline is a little bit more accurate than a linear one, because you can actually see how these ideas are layered on each other and then they'll build on each other as time goes. Because obviously that questioning attitude during the Renaissance is going to create that curiosity and that drive even more for worldwide exploration of the European powers. So let's move into our main segment of the day, which is really covering the main ideas of the Northern Renaissance. So the Northern Renaissance, to be clear, was influenced by obviously the Italian ideas that we discussed on episode 17, but developed more of a Christian-focused humanism. Art and literature and intellectual life in the North were deeply tied to religious reform and a focus on realism. And I often will use this painting, and I'll try to remember to put this in the show notes, because on the top of my head right now, I cannot remember the artist. I keep wanting to say Peter Bruegel the Elder. I think it's him. But there's a great painting of just like peasants in a farm, like farmers working in a field. And this is something that would have been very unusual to see paintings of in the Middle Ages, whenever it's more about the divine and whatnot. But there it is. It's a painting of regular common people in a realistic scenario working out in the field. I just showed my students this on Friday, and I think that's a great one. Another key example that you could use is from an artist named Albrecht Dürer, and the painting is called The Four Apostles. And this painting combines precise realism with religious symbolism, and it showcases the blend of Northern humanism and artistic skill. Now, I'm going to put a link within this show description from a website called the Web Gallery of Art, and it has a pretty decent description of the painting. You can also click on it and zoom way in. So there's not a lot going on in the background, but it looks like two separate panels, and you can kind of see that it is a stronger focus on realism. It looks much different than if you show your students what Middle Ages art looks like when in terms of royalty or religious figures. And you can tell a significant difference in the detail and the realism on people's bodies and faces, their proportion. You do not see halos around the back of their heads, even though these are religious figures. And these are some of those little aspects that you may overlook, but that's where I have fun at showing my students that before and after of common themes and symbolism in the Middle Ages, and then show them the different themes and symbolism of the Renaissance. It's so much fun to see that contrast there. Now, in order to connect the Northern Renaissance to modernity, in class you could discuss how the Northern Renaissance laid the intellectual groundwork for movements like the Protestant Reformation in Unit 2, impacting European society's structure and religious landscape going forward. Now, while we're on the topic of art here, I think this is a good transition to go into another important topic here, and that is naturalism. This is something, again, that sets Northern Renaissance art apart from Italian Renaissance art. And naturalism in the Northern Renaissance emphasized a highly detailed and realistic portrayal of the subjects, often grounded in everyday life and religious scenes, just like the one I mentioned earlier from Peter Bruegel, the Elder. And another key example that you could look on this is Jan van Eyck's painting, the Arnolfini portrait. And I have this on a slideshow. I also have it zoomed in different parts and broken down so you can see the symbolism. It's another painting that you could, as a teacher or as a student, load up on your screen and tell the students to treat it like a CSI crime scene and break down what it means. This is a challenging painting. I recommend maybe doing an easier one at first, but this is a great one to walk students through. But it shows meticulous attention to detail, lifelike texture, and symbolic elements, all hallmarks of that Northern Renaissance naturalism. Again, and it shows off that individuality of this couple that is in the painting. I'll attach that link as well in the show description so you can see the four apostles and the Arnolfini painting as well. Now, the focus on realism and domestic scenes in the Northern art reflected a growing interest in individual experience, spirituality, and the material world, diverging from the idealized forms of the Italian Renaissance. And that's something that's very important to know about that contrast, because there is a dichotomy there between the two styles, but there's a significant contrast. And if you go back to the last episode, we discussed this in the Statue of David, that is Michelangelo's version. You can also see evidence of it in School of Athens or the Birth of Venus painting, that it's not just these ancient Greek and Roman kind of figures, but also it's like these idealized, romanticized, better versions of these people than what they probably were in real life. Whereas Northern Renaissance art is more grounded in realism and kind of getting that more accurate. Both of them are excellent styles of art, but very, very different on that. So to move on to our next topic, one of my personal favorites to discuss every year is the printing press. For anybody that's new to this particular topic, as far as Europe goes, because obviously the Chinese were the first to be able to do the printing press, and you could see that Europe added more to it and perfected on that idea and improved it. So you have Johannes Gutenberg inventing it in the German states, or the Holy Roman Empire at the time, around 1440. And this new machine, this device, is going to have a significant revolutionary impact on European society. And a great example for this, again, and we can kind of build off of what we had mentioned on yesterday's episode, is think of the mass production of Erasmus's work. So like his writing In Praise and Folly, it's going to spread humanist ideas very quickly across Europe, and it's going to democratize the access to knowledge and encouraging religious and intellectual reform. But that reform, as we shall see, does not come easy and without conflict, as traditional authorities will attest to that. But think about this, is that, it's easier to gain access to these materials. And before the Renaissance, it wouldn't have been easy to obtain an education if you weren't from a wealthier family. Now, the printing press's impact is credited with accelerating the spread of Renaissance ideas, fueling movements like the Protestant Reformation that we'll see in Unit 2, and helping to shape public opinion by making text more accessible. Now, in my class, we often will discuss the socioeconomic impact on daily life and for commoners over the course of time, whether it be an increase of literacy rates, educational opportunities, financial opportunities in that, etc. It also is interesting to compare the printing press with the internet and the spread of information, but also the spread of misinformation. And obviously the church is going to rely heavy on the printing press as well. You know, the Bible will be one of the most selling books in world history, but also it's going to be a machine that will help people release documents that questions the authority of the church and its ideas. And you're going to see that later on in Unit 4 when we cover Nicholas Copernicus is a great example, and Galileo and some of these figures in the past. But I really like doing the printing press. You can also do a great maybe modern day Socratic seminar discussion over the printing press compared to the internet. And I just find it to be a really interesting topic. And it's a good way to kind of reinforce that supply and demand discussion and an economic impact with students. Since in Kentucky, they have to know those economic themes and ideas going into their state exam when they do that. Now, our next topic will be, it's explicitly in AP as well in a section called the New Monarchs. So we deviate a little bit from the themes that we've done earlier. We kind of go up to royalty now, and how are the governments and how are the leaders of these countries, how are they using the Renaissance ideas? What are they going to do in this time period to lead to other things in the future that we cover, especially Unit 3 after fall break. So these new monarchs, and these are names such as Ferdinand and Isabella from Spain, Henry VII of England, and Louis XI of France. These kind of kings and queens will centralize power onto themselves. It's very important to really reiterate that. They're going to also reduce the influence of nobility. You got to think in the past, nobility used to be able to raise armies and collect taxes. And now the king and queens, the monarchies, want to be able to do that and consolidate more power on them. And you can assume that's not going to go over well with the nobility as well. So it says, and it also creates a more efficient state systems, a bureaucracy that we'll see to have states run more efficiently. Now, the AP course guide under this section explicitly uses names like Henry VIII and his daughter and future queen after him, Elizabeth I. And these will be some of those early examples of centralizing power upon them and instituting secular models of running a state. And you can use this again to kind of go back and connect to Machiavelli and the Prince from yesterday's episode. If you're teaching this, or if you're trying to write an essay as a student, you're trying to bring up as much like continuity there or some correlation between ideas. This is also going to lay the foundation for absolute monarchs such as Louis XIV and James I later, these divine right of kings sort of monarchs. Now, a solid example to go a little bit more in detail, since we're going to be doing exploration next here, could be Ferdinand and Isabella's unification of Spain and their religious policies, including the Reconquista and the support for Columbus's voyages. It will reflect the consolidation of state power and the control over religious affairs, and that's going to help calm down civil unrest, and that's something that a lot of these new monarchs want to get under control as well. And that Ferdinand and Isabella reference is a great segue into the second half of Unit 1 for the Age of Exploration, or the Age of Discovery unit that you're doing too. You can get into those motives of why they're exploring, and then it doesn't become a very big surprise that the largest empire over there will be Spain originally, before it starts to collapse over time. Now, these rulers, to finish up the new monarch section, were instrumental in shaping modern nation states by strengthening royal authority, reducing internal conflicts, and exerting more centralized control, paving the way for the rise of a topic that you need to know in AP called absolutism, or absolute monarchies, in which monarchies have total control over the state, They dispense justice and collect taxes and raise militaries on there, and then we'll obviously see a revolution against that idea later on too, when we see the birth of constitutionalism in England, and it's just going to be really interesting to kind of cover that later, and then be able to come back to this and show that connection over time there. Now our last main topic of the day will be Erasmus. So to try to finish up him here, and a way to kind of break off and kind of hit on some specific points about him. Erasmus, again, was a leading figure in the Northern Humanism. And I kind of teach him as though he's kind of like Petrarch in the North. So Petrarch really spawned and got that Renaissance going in the South with people like Dante and others, and Boccaccio and them. But Erasmus is going to be one of those prominent names intellectually in the North. And he's going to advocate for not just religious tolerance and reform, but educational reform. And also, like Petrarch, encourage the study of classical text alongside those Christian teachings. And imagine how unusual that sounds. So you're still doing that classical reference again of the Renaissance, but he's wanting to kind of combine those with Christian teachings. And you got to think, for your majority of your European population, this would be a great way of combining those ideas together. So in Erasmus's In Praise of Folly, that's a satirical critique of society and ecclesiastical corruption, reflecting Erasmus's belief in reforming the church from within rather than breaking away from it. So that's a very different vibe than what we're going to see in Unit 2 with Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Zwingli in Switzerland, where you're going to see a very aggressive breakaway from those Catholic teachings and ideas. So he's trying to kind of get those changes going from within. And we all know from history too, trying to change anything from within, especially if it's extremely powerful and there's a lot of money involved, it's a very difficult thing to do whenever reputations are involved and prestige is involved, because by changing certain things, you might also be admitting to error and possibility. And how does that reflect on the image and the prestige of a certain organization or a certain monarch or something like that? Now, the impact of Erasmus's writings, they're going to influence religious reformers like Martin Luther and the broad intellectual climate of Europe. It's going to emphasize that reason and rationalism again, and ethical living, and also the study of classical antiquity. And there's that antiquity word again about meaning classics like ancient Greek, ancient Rome. And there's another reason again why sometimes I'll use rationalism with the other isms of humanism, individualism, and secularism, because there is this encouraging of reason even before we get to René Descartes in Unit 4. Now, as you know, one of my favorite sections of the podcast I'm going to try to start doing now is a philosophical question section to leave the listener, whether it be a teacher or a student or someone interested in history, with some ideas that they can take away from this episode and ask themselves, have a conversation with a buddy on there or another teacher or student. So the first question, again, a two-part compound question here, is how did the focus on realism and everyday experience in Northern Renaissance art reflect the broader cultural changes of Europe? And do we see echoes of this shift in how we value the ordinary in today's society? And on this, you need to encourage students and each other to think about how art's focus on realism influences our understanding of history and culture, as well as the contemporary society that we live in. And I want you to think about, a couple of episodes back when I was interviewing Jared Frederick from Real History on YouTube. One of those things that stuck with me and other listeners is that when you're watching movie clips from different places, or you're listening to radio feeds, but specifically in this case movies, is you should also ask yourself, hey, here's this movie that's about some older historical event, and now it's coming out now in this particular year. Ask yourself, how does that movie reflect the time period that it's actually made in? And you got to think about the way a movie is played, the way a history event is portrayed in a movie, a play, or anything like that. That is often a reflection of what society is going through in those times, what the values are, and what are some of those controversial issues. So the same story in history could be told multiple times through human history and have completely different portrayals and perspectives and interpretations, because we have to think also beyond the movie, beyond just what's in front of us, and thinking deeper. And I think that's what we're all trying to do with our students here, is to get them to look between the lines, think deeper, more naturally as they go forward. So the second question, the last of the episode today, reads as this: can Erasmus's approach of seeking reform within existing institutions be applied to current debates about change in our own society? Is gradual reform more effective than revolutionary change? Yeah, I know, especially in an election year like this year, these kind of questions can be very controversial, but also very fun to do as a teacher, to have conversations with each other. It's one of those moments where you reinforce the students again that it's important to not become emotional whenever you're debating and whenever you're having discussions. Rely on supporting your claims with reason and with evidence to be able to do that, because you want your opponents to be able to listen to you. You want to work in the compromise and be able to make headway, not just for talking to talk on that. So I do think that this is a great way to get students to talk about the effectiveness of reform versus revolution. And maybe there's a certain time for both, and maybe there's a way that reform can work most of the time and avoid revolutions. And I know that if this was Machiavelli in the case, he's trying to encourage anything possible to avoid a revolution, even if it results in the use of fear and violence to be able to do that. So that wraps up this episode here. Another short, close to 30-minute episode, finishing up the Renaissance. Again, I do want to tell listeners that some of you may know more about the Renaissance than me. You may teach it differently. You might have more people or more detail you add. So I apologize for any gaps of knowledge that I provide there. It's not perfect, but at least it gives you some of those main ideas that you really need to know going through the rest of the year and being able to apply these ideas forward. So I hope you found value in this episode. I hope that you all have a great week ahead. And as always, be contagious.